Hello, I'm Bryn Lucas, standing in for Martin Lynn. Joining me, as always, Matt Q and John Noble. First of all, hello to you, John. How you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. I've got the first lurgy of the season, unfortunately. I think Saudi Arabia, all the travel, the madness of the timetables caught up with me. So battling through it, dosed up on paracetamol and Lemsip, all that sort of shabazz, but we'll get there.
You poor little sausage. Not all heroes wear capes, right?
No, I don't know where my cape is actually, but I'll dig it out.
Matt, how are you doing? Are you in fine health?
Yeah, absolutely. I sat next to John for most of Saudi Arabia, so it must have been a plane ride home when we went our separate ways, John. I'm sorry to hear it.
Oh dear, oh dear. Well, look, we're going to look ahead at the Australian Grand Prix Melbourne. Will it be, do you think, a walk in the Albert Park for Max and Pacheco?
I think you can't say after the performance they've shown in the first few races that anyone other than Red Bull is clear favourite for it. I know in qualifying it appears to be a bit closer. Leclerc's got very, sniffing on the heels of the Red Bulls in qualifying. But race pace, that Red Bull just has the edge. We saw it in Saudi. Fernando Alonso was able to match Perez in that early stint, but the second when Red Bull decided to unleash a bit more pace, just disappeared into the distance. So I think the Red Bull in race pace is still streets ahead of everyone else. It's been managing things. We saw in Bahrain, they were told to slow down by 0.7 seconds. In Saudi, they were told to back off because of concerns about reliability. So they're not unleashing full pace yet. So I think I'd be very surprised if anyone other than Red Bull comes out on top this weekend.
To add to John's point, is how customisable the pace is. So Saudi Arabia, okay, they had a tuned rear wing, which some teams didn't bring that early into the season, but it was just top of all the speed traps, doing all its business in a straight line. But then in Bahrain, it was Ferrari that was quickest down the straights, and Red Bull was extracting all its pace through like the downforce dependent corners. So to have that like breadth of capabilities and for it to be so tunable, and to add to that, everyone said, "Oh, Bahrain's just an anomaly because the tarmac's so abrasive. We get to Saudi Arabia and we'll be much closer," and they weren't. So put all that together, it's a really, really imposing picture from Red Bull.
Yeah, John, you wrote very recently a video on this channel about Red Bull and DRS and all the aspects of their setup. They just seem to have it all right, don't they?
A lot of people talk about Red Bull and Adrian Newey's involvement and how great the aerodynamics are, but I think the RB19 is much more about the entire package. I think as teams are digging down into just why that Red Bull is so quick, I think a lot of it's to do with kind of the ride and mechanical aspects and suspension. It can basically, that car performs well under braking, under acceleration, in cornering. It's very stable. And I think with these regulations, if you can have your peak downforce aero map, place your car where you want it and it maintains that, tons of performances there. And this is the thing that other teams have struggled with. Mercedes last year was chasing downforce really, really low to the ground, couldn't achieve it because of porpoising. Back to way this year, it's now produced a car that produces its downforce higher up, but it's too high up for enough downforce. So they've gone the other extreme. And I think Red Bull have just found a complete sweet spot. They appear able to run that car as low to the ground as they want without porpoising, and it's performing in all areas. So it's a combination of downforce, the right wing settings, being aggressive on their aero choices, ride, suspension, mechanics, and a car that delivers huge confidence for Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez.
This weekend sees Red Bull will make 350 starts since they made their debut back at the same place in 2005. And Max Verstappen, if he gets a pole position, can equal Alonso's 22. So he's got a lot of things going for numbers, doesn't it, for Red Bull?
Absolutely. Although, can I throw a statistic back at you, Bryn, which is obviously we had two Aussie Grand Prix cancelled because of COVID, so that means 3 out of the last 4 have been won by Ferrari. So shall we clutch onto that one in anticipation of a different winner and to change the narrative?
Well, let's stay with Ferrari just for a few moments, because Charles Leclerc last year, as we know, got his first ever career Grand Slam, his only one to date really, with a pole position, fastest lap and a race win. So what do you reckon? Do they have any chance, Matt?
The optimist in me wants to say yes, and then they do have a bizarrely good track record there. You think to sort of 2017, 18, 2022, they come out quickly out the blocks, and you think, right, we've got a proper title fight on our hands here, and they've all fizzled out. But it'd be great if history could repeat itself in that sense. But I don't see necessarily where the Ferrari pace is coming from, because it just has seen it being inferior to Red Bull, and Fred Vasseur said after the first couple of races, or after Bahrain in particular, that it's setup tweaks. Once we sort of refine this car, then we've got the pace in it. But then the drivers at the end of a frustrating day in Saudi Arabia saying, no, we need upgrade packages now, and the upgrades won't be there in Melbourne. So there's not enough for me, or there's not enough to suggest that they will be that much closer, even though, you know, that Ferrari has good aero efficiency, and Albert Park, where they've opened up a few of the corners, it does sort of promote that the faster corners. But yeah, not enough for me to be wholly convinced about Ferrari's prospects.
I think it's going to be tough for them, but I think it will give us a proper glimmer of just where Ferrari's placed its car. It chased efficiency this year, and the consequence of that is efficiency means potentially less downforce. It's been sliding more on corners and not managing the tyres as well. I mean, last year was fine, it got the win, but Verstappen was out of the race. So I think a lot of the early Ferrari form last year was kind of flattered by the fact Red Bull started on the back foot with reliability. So, there's no reason Verstappen, could have won in Bahrain, could have won Australia, were it not for the mechanical problems. So I think it'll be a proper glimmer of just what Ferrari can do. And I think if they come out of this weekend 30 seconds behind again, I don't think Vasseur can continue saying this is a setup problem. I think it's a fundamental, this is where the Ferrari is, and some bigger changes are needed.
Well, briefly staying with Ferrari then, Matt. Last time out to Martin, you were talking about the change of tide, really, I suppose, in Ferrari. It seems to be a team full of turmoil at the moment.
Well, I suppose they've obviously had the high-profile departure of David Sanchez, who not only has sort of stepped back but gone to what's the key phrase, an upwardly mobile team in McLaren, so effectively someone who could become a rival. And as Sanchez has proven by not starting at McLaren until the 1st of January, gardening leaves are rife in Formula One, so their tech team is depleted. It's going to take them a while to recruit from outside, so there it's a case of sort of plugging various holes. And how that'll impact their car developments and upgrades going forward. And while Fred Vasseur has insisted there's a really healthy relationship with the sporting director Mekis, that the cynical part of me says no smoke without fire. Why would those rumours be spreading? And that he had potentially been approached by the FIA, and that his role will be reduced, or he will certainly be less high profile, less in the media. Why would that be happening if there wasn't some degree of discontent? The flip side to that is it allows him to focus on the job in hand, and maybe that's a better idea. But yeah, it's certainly noise of instability.
Yeah, it doesn't always, no smoke without fire, maybe the best message to take from that one there. Now, what about last time out then? A lot of chat about the Aston Martin penalty/non-penalty, and then Max coming from 15th on the grid to do such wonderful things as finishing second. But do you think, John, that Perez's incredible finish, that victory, was slightly overlooked by every other story going on?
I think so. There's a lot going on in the background. People talked about Max charging through from 15th to finish second, and this wasn't a good showing from Perez. But you've got to remember, after the safety car, they were on pretty equal terms. And once Perez had cleared Alonso, it was game on, both of them pushing as hard as they could, and Perez maintained that gap. So it wasn't as if Max was closing in on him. And I know there were reliability issues and questions, but Verstappen's not going to back off if he senses a win's coming. So I think it was a great performance from Sergio. I think it shows that on the day he can deliver the form that's going to win it. And I think Max knows this. That's why there was such this push for the fastest lap. That point was quite significant in changing who was leading the World Championship. So I think the key for Perez will be consistency, being able to deliver these performances week in, week out, if he wants to mount a full championship challenge. And potentially, he's going to need to get under Verstappen's skin, isn't he? This is going to have to be a scenario like Rosberg and Hamilton in 2016, where Perez may have to accept that, all things being equal, Max would likely have more wins. But if he can keep pushing, keep determined, keep his focus, maybe ruffle a few feathers, that championship sniff could be there.
It'll be exhausting for Perez. We saw, the toll it took on Rosberg, but his as John said, his race pace was good. Okay, if you look at like their 10 fastest laps in a race and take it as an average for that final stint, Verstappen was half a tenth a lap quicker. But compared to where that gap has been, when it's been half a second as it was through much of that weekend, that's a really impressive performance from Perez. Okay, he fluffed his start a bit, and Verstappen was clearing traffic, but you saw from how everyone's been reading into Jos Verstappen not congratulating Perez after, and as John says, that they're the sort of things that suggest there are a few ruffled feathers, and also on the acrimony of Hamilton Rosberg. If you think back to Max obviously defying team orders in Brazil when second in the championship was at stake for Perez, and this gamesmanship of nicking fastest lap. Drivers do have a long-term memory. If Perez needs to return a favour to Max, okay, he's probably more vulnerable in that team in terms of when his contract expiration is, and Max is so clearly the protege who everything revolves. But he might choose to go, no thanks, you're all right. I helped you in Abu Dhabi 2021. I helped you on occasions last season with defending against a Ferrari. So you look after yourself from now on, Max, and just see whether that narrative plays out, and a bit of tension, and how the team has to manage that. Because certainly through this sort of modern era of Red Bull, Max Verstappen has been completely unchallenged, so they haven't had to manage sort of too much infighting.
Yeah, we're only, 2 rounds into the season. This one seems to be a story that's going to rumble and rumble and rumble. If we go back then to Ferrari and Mercedes, still got a lot to do this season. They seem to be a long way off, but with a different nature, shall we say, of the Albert Park circuit, will that hand them some gains along the way?
For Mercedes, I don't think so. I think that car is struggling for downforce. There's a lot of rear-end instability, which Lewis in particular is struggling with. He can't get confident with it. I think there's some inherent platform or inherent concept that he doesn't like in that car that needs addressing. So I think it's not going to be a good track for them at all, really. Albert Park, mediums, even some high-speed corners. Now it's where you need decent confidence in that car if you're going to deliver a lap. So I think I'm not expecting it to be a particularly strong track for Mercedes. I think they're biding their time until they can get these upgrades coming through, potentially for Imola. But even then, those upgrades aren't going to deliver them the 1 second deficit they're still facing to Red Bull.
Seems like a long way off, doesn't it, Imola?
Yeah, it does. And before then, we've got the picture could get worse for Mercedes. You've got McLaren, who have toned down expectations. They're not saying now that the Baku upgrade will sort of make or break their season. They're just saying it's one of several steps they need to take. But there's every possibility that someone like that could come from behind and sort of make Mercedes worse before it gets better. And not to get too off topic, but Mercedes have this no blame culture which they're sticking to admirably, and Ferrari tried to copy it. It's slightly lost in translation, but that's why Binotto lost his job. But now you're looking at McLaren, who have obviously given James Key the heave-ho in a really different sort of different philosophy. They have pointed the finger at someone, and all this time McLaren have been going, just wait for our new infrastructure to come online, and then we'll be really sort of going at full tilt and making strides up the grid. Well, they've decided they're not willing to wait that long and have sort of made someone highly accountable, and it's whether Mercedes stick to what they're doing or decide they need a restructure. I'm not saying that anyone should lose their job over it, but it's whether they decide to be a bit more decisive than what they have been so far.
You've kind of read my mind there, because I was going to move this on to the middle of the pack. And actually, when we think about McLaren, forget the middle of the pack at the moment. It's much further back for them, but a fair few changes going on at Woking over the last week or so, shall we say. How do you see this midfield, the middle of the pack, starting to settle down as we make our way into the season? If I head over to you first, John.
I don't think it will settle down. I think there's an interesting kind of double dynamic going on in Formula 1 at the moment. You've got the long-term impact of the cost cap, which I think is actually kind of entrenching a consistency of performance. So it's very difficult for teams to make big steps over the course of the season. The old days of, if you're behind, you throw more money at it, you move forward, and you get this constant roller coaster of form. I think that's gone now. I think it's consistent small steps throughout the season. But I think what it's done is it's closed up the field. So now there's virtually no difference between, say, the 4th, 5th fastest team and being the 8th, 9th fastest team. And it's a couple of temps. So that comes down to setup, driver confidence, nailing a weekend, not making mistakes. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of consistency in terms of who the midfield teams are, but inconsistency in terms of how they stack up. So on good days, teams are going to be in Q3 nailing the points, and on the bad days, they're going to get knocked out in Q1 and have a lot of explaining to do. So I think we've got this double narrative that's going to go through the season of it being both predictable and unpredictable.
Predictably unpredictable, then.
Yeah, not too much to add on that, but you can add in sort of the early season upgrades. So before crashes or some teams underfunding, before that sort of makes itself known with latter season updates, there will be sort of the toing and froing as each team, depending on their timetable, depending on which track they favour for their upgrades, or McLaren are saying that our upgrade that's coming for Baku is not going to be Baku specific, so we might not see an instant hit. So you will have the massive toing and froing from race to race, which, not to put it down on everything, but if Red Bull is as dominant as we suspect, that's going to be one of the key battle brands to make the season as interesting as it possibly can be.
So who do you expect is going to come out on top of the midfield pack then, John? Put you on the spot, really. If we kind of disregard Red Bull, disregard Mercedes and Ferrari, you'd have to be looking maybe at Alonso, but can you regard him as a mid-pack driver now? I'm not sure we can.
No, I think Aston Martin's kind of pulled clear of that midfield battle. I think it's on the good days and good weekends. I think it still has the potential to shadow Red Bull. I think if Fernando can get on the front row, cause a bit of trouble, get under the skin again of Verstappen and Red Bull, and just do what he's brilliant at, which is just being ruthlessly quick, then I think on the good days he can be challenging. And I still expect Aston Martin to be the main threat to Red Bull this weekend. Maybe not the potential to outpace them on track, but the potential is there to cause trouble. A good strategy, a slight slip up from Red Bull, reliability problems, and he could pounce and be there. So I think there. But in terms of that midfield, I mean, I want to see more from Alpine. There's still a bit of a mystery that they have these flashes of good speed, but they've had some disappointing performances. Gasly in particular struggling in qualifying. So I think they've not kind of nailed that car. They're the team that should be emerging from the top of that pack until the McLaren upgrades come through, but we've not seen it yet.
So Alonso, the pretender to the crown maybe in Australia, says John. I've kind of subbed that down a little bit, John. What do you say then, Matt?
I'm going to try and be bolder than John, I reckon, and just go, so we've been working together at the races to analyse where each car is quick using some GPS data, and the Aston, in particular Alonso, it's under the braking and really low speed acceleration. So some of the fiddly corners at Albert Park, I know it's been opened up a bit for that middle sector, but some of the fiddly 90-degree stuff, if Alonso's late on the brakes and early on the power, that should really favour him, and tyre degradations in the ballpark of Red Bull, so that should be good. So come on, let's see what he can do there. And then but I will completely agree with John in terms of Alpine. They launched with this, bold. Every team had favoured Evolution. They've gone for the closest thing to Revolution with their new car, and they've talked up about how they're going to outdevelop every team, and that's how they're going to be just on the coattails of the top three come the end of the season. And we've not seen anything to suggest that they are that sort of. They've got that much sort of headroom, I suppose. I mean, there's definitely potential in that car, but they're definitely falling short of expectations. So what they can do.
Yeah, well, John, we're kind of not far off from Practice, and you had an article out earlier in the week about this, just hinting at discussions about cancelling Practice altogether. Can you kind of give us an idea of what that was all about? Yeah,
it was the normal kind of storm in a teacup we often get in the media and social media these days. So it was a quote from Stefano Domenicali. It was interviewed by a Portuguese sports channel at the MotoGP race in Portugal. Talked about that he'd like to see the cancellation of Practice because it's something for engineers and not for the fans. The fans don't like it much, which was then kind of snowballed into this. Domenicali wants to get rid of Fridays completely, and fans obviously not happy because Fridays are an important part of a Grand Prix weekend. But I think the reality is what he's talking about is further tweaks to the Grand Prix weekend format. We know the sprint races have come in, which I think have generally been good if you look at the kind of holistic whole weekend. I think people may not like the Saturday races, they may not bring as much excitement as we hoped, but the impact they've had on weekends in the unpredictability, the lessons that teams take from Saturdays into Sundays, the way they can turn things around, I think they've been decisive in making Sundays a lot better, and the Fridays are definitely better. One practice session straight into qualifying, I think it's great. More jeopardy is what we want in this sport. So this is what Domenicali is talking about. They're talking about maybe that FP2 session on a sprint weekend falling between qualifying and the sprint doesn't really do anything. It's an hour of running for engineers that counts for almost nothing for the fans. So do we do something there? Do you offer a point for top in Practice and change the dynamics? So do we do something different on Fridays? Do we do one practice session and then a shootout in the afternoon, or a points offering session? So these are the discussions going on. It's not about cancelling Practice and further cutting back on running. It's about refining the weekend to make things more engaging, more interesting, and giving people a reason to tune in.
On that point there, Matt, why do you think F1 is constantly, it seems like a weekly thing now, trying to reinvent itself? I mean, first of all, we had that suggestion that testing is boring, and now practice is boring. What are we going to do next? Are we going to say we don't have any practice, any testing at all, and we just go gung-ho with cold tyres? Is that the way it's going to go?
Well, certainly all those ideas are being floated. I just wonder how much of it is a bigger picture stuff. So if you look at, say, the last two series of Drive to Survive, mixed critical reception, less real estate on the homepage, and you've got like the Keanu Reeves Braun documentary, the Brad Pitt sort of Hollywood blockbuster. But F1's current popularity boom is amazing and so far has proved sustainable, but you've got to be looking 1-2 steps beyond that, so there's not a massive drop off in audience and sponsors and commercial deals, and there's an inevitable sort of cycle of boom and bust, but you can minimise the fluctuation of that. So if you can turn every event into a blockbuster and get back to that fanciful original goal when Liberty Media came in of having every race as like a Super Bowl, then they obviously hope that will sustain an audience and provide a supplement from when Netflix goes, no thanks, we no longer want to pay you for the privilege of recording everything that's made you a smash hit over the last 5 years. We need to reverse that relationship or whatever. So when that deal comes to an end, or it's upset too many customers by banning password sharing, Formula One needs to have like an oven-ready solution for that. And if that means ripping up the format and changing the dynamic of it, then I guess nothing should be left off the table.
We should have to wait and see on that one. So let's cast our eyes firmly on the Grand Prix itself then. And since the track change last year, there were 27 overtakes on track last year. There were 17 in total in the previous 3 Grand Prix at the same circuit. So, John, are we expecting to see, a gung-ho overtake fest?
I don't think so. I think they've been quite calm, the Grand Prix this year. I mean, beyond Verstappen's charge, which was, boosted simply by their top speed advantage, I don't think we've seen as much battling. Bahrain was definitely less overtaken than we've seen in the past. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with this 4th DRS zone, because last year was a bit of politicking from teams who felt that they were being disadvantaged by this extra zone, which it's not designed to provide an overtaking opportunity. It's designed to allow a car to close onto the back of another before the next zone to make the pass. So I think there'll be a certain amount of intrigue. And, if Red Bull's DRS advantage is as great in Australia as it was in Saudi, then don't rule out other teams starting politicking and asking, can we get rid of this DRS zone to try to peg them back a bit?
Yeah, Albert Park is sort of... So it's a good staple of the calendar, but doesn't produce thrillers despite the track changes they've made. So it'll be that test of I'm not going to the Australian Grand Prix, so it's a sort of 5:45 alarm. If I'm still awake by 9:15, then I suppose it will have been a good one.
You've really sold that one to me, Matt. Thanks very much. It's an intriguing battle, though, isn't it? Really, with the way, even if there's no overtakes, it's still an intriguing battle there. John, where do you think we're going to see Red Bull at the moment? They're seeking their 3rd consecutive 1-2 for the first time in their history, and it'll be their 25th 1-2 overall. Do we really just suggest that it's going to be a Red Bull 1-2 and it's a debate about who's going to get that first position, or can we look elsewhere?
No, I mean, I think Alonso's still the best bet to try to cause trouble, but I do think the Red Bull advantage is still significant. And I know some people are kind of put off by the prospect of this dominance, but this is the kind of domination you get in Formula One. And I always find it interesting because while teams are dominant, the interest comes from when they stumble and when they fall off the top and when someone finally beats them. It becomes even more important and means even more. So you've got that intra-battle inside Red Bull, which has come alive after Saudi Arabia. Can Sergio Perez continue to put Max under a bit of pressure? So you've got that. You've got the Alonso potential to get there. And at some point, Red Bull, potentially won't get it right. Potentially the door will be opened up and someone's going to come in. And that, knowing the dominance of that team, that makes that victory even sweeter.
Yeah, Matt, if you look at it elsewhere, we look at Ferrari, you see Charles Leclerc, where he is currently in the championship. We know his teammate Carlos Sainz is kind of outperforming him at the moment. It's Mercedes. You got Lewis just keeping fifth each time there, and George bouncing around either side of him. So it's sort of making for some pretty good rivalries between inter-team rivalries going on.
Yeah, absolutely. We know how important that narrative is, because obviously your first benchmark is your teammate, and particularly those two teams, Mercedes and Ferrari. I think there's no illusions as to who the number one or the team leader or the talisman, the star figure is. And obviously, I think at Mercedes, Russell's performances are closer to Hamilton's than Sainz is, and are main to Leclerc, and certainly in terms of influence. But it's a narrative that people are enjoying, isn't it? Young upstart sort of toppling the the incumbent in terms of Mercedes and Hamilton, and then it'll be good for Ferrari, because I think, again, behind Mercedes it's probably the second best driver lineup on the grid. So what that can do to destabilise not necessarily the relationship between the two, although there were a couple of flashpoints last year where Leclerc probably felt, Silverstone or Monaco felt he should have had a better rub of the green than he got versus Sainz. But again, it's something that keeps interesting, because whenever there is dissatisfaction at the top of the team, then that infighting can become a bit more if tempers are already frayed. So yeah, certainly something to keep an eye on. I don't expect too much mic drops in media pens with outrageous quotes sort of stoking it between them, but certainly a toing and froing of on-track results should keep it quite amusing.
Yeah, finally, John, are we going to see any curveballs out there this weekend?
I still think the biggest curveball is Aston Martin, in terms of what can it do on a weekend where it gets everything right. In Bahrain, they kind of let themselves down a little bit in qualifying. And then Fernando obviously lost position on the first lap when he was hit by Lance Stroll and dropped back behind the Mercedes. So we didn't see that potential, which would have been fascinating just to know what he could have done if he was managing his own pace on that tyre degradation. Saudi Arabia, we know the Aston Martin's not quick in a straight line. Its choice of rear wings, it didn't have the kind of the lower downforce option on its table, which Red Bull had. So it was never going to be a match for Red Bull there. But we're going somewhere now which should better suit the car. This should be, the upper end of where Aston Martin performs. So I think that's the one I want to see. Can he get amongst those two Red Bulls? Can he cause a bit of trouble to either Max or Checo in front? And can he force them into strategy compromises or teammate compromises that puts Red Bull under pressure? Because when teams are under pressure, that's when they make mistakes.
Absolutely. Well, a street circuit followed by another street circuit and then another street circuit before we move away from the street circuits. It's going to be a decent battle hopefully this weekend. Matt, you're going to be watching it with some popcorn, I'm sure, and trying to stay awake from what you said on that moment just there. And John as well, I'm sure you'll be keeping your eyes open on this one and seeing how it all plays out ahead of the next one in Baku and Azerbaijan. Thank you very much indeed there, gents. It's been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully you enjoyed watching this as well. Keep your comments coming in below. We do love to know what you think. And we're back in the conclusion, or at the conclusion, of the Australian Grand Prix. We'll see you then.